All right, so let's start with lesson number 1. And this is the most important thing, I think. Well, actually, I think they're all important, of course, or they wouldn't be in my talk today. But the first lesson, the most important thing to start with parents, is the idea of being emotionally responsive. Now, what do I mean by that? I really mean that when a child is experiencing an emotion, whether that's a positive emotion, a negative emotion, a really reactive, explosive emotion, or more of a shut down kind of emotion, whatever's going on for them, what's most important is that we see what their actual experience is, what they're really feeling, and then we validate it. We tune into it and respond to it. Now, I know that in your interactions with your significant other, there are times you have big feelings about things. Maybe it's rational, maybe it's not rational, maybe you're stressed out and you're overreacting in bigger ways than are maybe even necessary. But that's how you feel in the moment. And sometimes the way we respond to our children, if we were to think about our significant other responding to us in those ways, we would realize that those responses are often not very helpful. Like, for instance, if you think about a time when maybe you're really stressed out, you've had a bad day, you're kind of like, and why is this house so messy? And we never get things done around here, or whatever you're ranting about in the moment. And your significant other says to you, well, you just need to come up with a better plan. You just need to calm down. Just calm down. You're tired. Go to bed. You know, the kinds of things that we say to our children all the time when they're in kind of these emotional states, those are not helpful responses. Not only can they further escalate the child's emotions, but they're really not very relational. They really help the child, they make the child feel in the moment like we don't get them, and that we're blaming them for how they feel. So what's most important is that we see their actual experience. What is actually going on for them, whether it's rational or not, whether it makes sense to us or not, what they are actually feeling. And what we need to do is validate or reflect that actual experience or those actual feelings. I remember I was giving a teacher in service at a little preschool, and one of the men in the audience raised his hand and he said, "Are you saying that you really want us to endorse what they're feeling?" And I said, well, I've never thought about that word, but yeah, that's another way to say it, that we actually reflect back. So an example of that is, for instance, your child is really mad. I don't want to go to bed. I'm so mad I have to go to bed. I want to stay at the party. We had this happen with our boys last weekend. We were at a really fun birthday party. It had gotten really late and it was time to go, and they were disappointed. And one of my sons in particular, started getting really unhappy. Now, I could have said something like, you should be grateful that you already got to go to the party. Or I could have said something like, you need to calm down right now or we're not going to go do something fun tomorrow. So I could have responded with, in the first case, kind of treating him like he was spoiled and kind of shutting down the feelings. In the second case, with a threat, if you don't stop fussing, we're not going to do something fun. Or I could have said, you're just overreacting because you're tired. Now, that may be true. In fact, all of many of those pieces may be true, but it's actually not very emotionally responsive. So instead, a better response would be to say, I know it's so disappointing that we have to leave. It can make you so mad when you have to change what you had hoped to happen. Now, most of the time we're pretty good at that. When we're tired, when our children have been pushing our buttons, that's harder. But the reason that it's so important to focus on the feelings instead of the actual behavior, like I could have gotten mad about him pouting, or I could have gotten mad about him kind of stomping and throwing his wet towel into the car after the swim party. And of course I can address those behaviors. But what's important is if we focus on the behavior instead of the emotion, it's similar to basically treating symptoms without ever knowing the cause. If you have a back injury and you just go start buying over-the-counter medication to treat the actual symptoms, but you never figure out what the injury is about or what actually is wrong, then you're going to have to keep treating the symptoms. And it's the same thing. Behavioral issues and behavioral problems and bad behavior are often a result of emotions kind of being big and not being expressed in mature ways. And there are lots of reasons that they're not expressed in mature ways because they're children and their brains are not yet done developing. But what's important is that if we go toward the emotions, we acknowledge the emotions, we reflect and validate, I understand, I see you, I see what you're actually feeling, I see your experience, and I understand, then we basically get to the cause, we get to the root. And when we address those in emotionally responsive and nurturing ways, it actually makes behavioral problems reduce greatly. Now, this is not at all to say that we're permissive as parents, that we just only talk about the feelings and we never address the behavior. But I'm going to be talking about how we do that as we continue today. But it's really important that you understand that that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we are emotionally responsive and we can still do that while setting boundaries. Now, being emotionally responsive actually calms the brain down. We can look at brain scans and see that when someone sees and reflects our emotions and helps us talk about them, that actually the reactive centers of the brain start calming down. It also, so that's more in the short term, but in the long term, it actually builds the brain as well. When parents are emotionally responsive, when we nurture them and we actually give lots of attention to their internal emotional world, it actually builds the connective fibers in the brain that make the reactive centers of the brain much more readily and easily calmed down by the more mature, reflective, higher parts of the brain. So when we have these repeated experiences with our children where we're emotionally responsive, we're actually changing their brains in a way that allows them to have better behavior and better emotional regulation over time. So that's essential. In fact, when I talk to teachers, I spend a lot of time talking about attachment and attachment relationships and how relationships build the brain. But I really stress this idea about being emotionally responsive with students and not just focus on the behavior or just focused on the academic results. Because when we actually do this, like I said, these connective fibers in the brain get connected in a way that actually increase academic performance and executive functioning skills and these kinds of things. And then the last piece, which I just briefly mentioned, is that it builds attachment. Secure attachment between parent and child is as a result of a parent being consistently, predictably, emotionally responsive. So when we provide sensitive, predictable care, where we pay attention to our child's emotional world, that is actually the essential piece of building secure attachment. And secure attachment is the best predictor we have for how well kids turn out in every area of domain, every domain that we measure. And in fact, if you're interested in that, I'd really recommend a book to you called The Development of the Person by Alan Sroufe, and his name is S-R-O-U-F-E. It's fantastic research, and it came out of the University of Minnesota for decades following children. And what we see is this attachment piece is essential. And the heart of that, like I said, is being emotionally responsive. So that's the first thing I start with kids. Now, let me give you another example from my clinical practice before I move on to the next lesson. So I taught this idea about being emotionally responsive to a mom. And in the book, The Whole Brain Child, that Dr. Dan Siegel and I co-authored, our first strategy in the book is called Connect and Redirect, and it goes into this from a more scientific, brain-based explanation with a lot of examples. So you're free to do a little bit more sleuthing there. But I had a mom that I taught this to, and I was telling her, you know, she felt like her daughter was actually quite difficult. She was a girl who had OCD. She also had sensory integration issues, and so she was very emotionally reactive in lots of different ways. So I had taught this mom about being emotionally responsive to her daughter, and I'll call her Calli. Of course, all the stories I tell, I will have changed details and names and all of that to protect the confidentiality of my families. So anyway, we're going to call her Calli, and so I had taught Calli's mom about this idea about being emotionally responsive. I said, no matter how ridiculous it seems to you, you stay with her in the moment of feelings, you reflect back her feelings, you let her know you understand her. So the mom said, I got it. And then a couple of weeks later, I went to meet Calli and her mom in my waiting room. And Calli stomped into the room with her arms folded, threw her things on the ground with a big huffy breath, and avoided eye contact, like that. And so I walked up to her and I got down on the floor. You'll hear me talking about that in a minute, about why I do that. I got down on the floor below her eye level. I put my hand on her knee and I said, "Oh, you're having such a hard time. You look so angry." And then I paused. So I just reflected what I saw her showing non-verbally, what was pretty clear to me, that she was upset, that she was mad. And she said, "I'm so mad. My brother got out on my side of the car and he stepped on my library book and I'm sure he tore it all up and now it's going to be all ripped up and I'm going to have to go in and tell the librarian that my book is ruined and she's going to scream at me and she's going to make me replace the book." And she was, just sort of spiraling out. And those of you who work with kids who struggle with anxiety, this is very familiar to you. And one of the things that she was most reactive about was about her brother. So I just sat with her and I stayed there with my hand on her knee and I said, "It made you so mad when he stepped on your book. You really wish he had gotten out on the other side. He was messing with your stuff and now you have all kinds of worries about what's coming next at school and those kinds of things." Now, I didn't jump to problem solving with her. I would have, but I actually didn't even need to in this circumstance. She took a big deep breath. She stood up, she walked into my office, and she was ready to begin the work that we had to do that day. It calmed her down just by me reflecting back and having her feel like I understood her. So a little while later, at the end of the session, I brought Mom in, as I always do at the end of my sessions, to kind of tell her what we've been working on and what I wanted them to continue at home. And the mom said, "Wow, that was kind of amazing what happened out there in the waiting room." And I said, "Well, that's the kind of thing I've been talking about." And the mom said, "Oh, I know that's what you told me to do, but I didn't know that's what it looked like. I didn't know that I really had to kind of, do it like that." So I said, "Well, let's practice." So I brought the daughter back in the room. And so I said, let's, is there something that has happened recently? So the mom brought something up that had happened at home. The brother had taken something out of her room. And so I instructed the mom. I coached her again. "Now, I want you to say, I remember what happened earlier and you were really upset about your brother coming into your room. And I want you to just stay with her feelings. No problem solving, none of that." So the mom brings it up. The daughter, Calli, starts saying, "Well, I'm so mad. He's not supposed to go in my room." And she, started to escalate emotionally, which is really sort of what we wanted in the moment, so that the mom could come in and do this emotionally responsive soothing. And Mom was great for about 20 seconds. She said, "Yeah, that made you really mad." It was kind of robotic at first, the way she started doing it. And then she said, "But I told you that you needed to put that up higher, and if you had put it up higher, he wouldn't have taken it." And I said, wait. "Mom, not yet. We're not going there." So it's really, the parents often need a lot of coaching on what this looks like. So you may have to do it kind of in vivo with them, practicing what this looks like, how to do it by you showing it, and coaching them along the way how to do it themselves. I learned the hard way that just talking about it with parents, even really high-functioning, educated, well-intentioned, nurturing parents, sometimes don't know how to do this. They don't know how to stay with the emotions. They immediately go to blame, to problem solving, or those kinds of things. So this is something that's really important because it builds attachment, it builds the brain in terms of change over time, and it also helps in the moment, which allows parents then to keep from escalating themselves. So I start with this because it's so key and essential, in a place I start with most of my families.